You know, when we hear the word depression, what's the first image that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's a picture of deep, overwhelming sadness. But what if that's only part of the story? What if that picture is, well, incomplete? Today, we're going to explore the silent, often totally invisible, structure of depression.
Right here, this is the core idea, the one that kind of challenges everything we think we know. It's the whole reason we're talking about this today. Depression doesn't always look like sadness. So, on one hand, you have the stereotype, right? Constant tears, staying in bed all day, and look, that is a very, very real experience for some people. But it can also look like the complete opposite. It can look like functioning perfectly, showing up to work, smiling when you're supposed to, and from the outside, looking like you're doing everything right. And that's the quiet paradox we're diving into.
And this really gets to the heart of that disconnect. On the outside, life can look totally normal. You're going through the motions, you're checking all the boxes, but inside there's this persistent, quiet heaviness. It's not always a sharp pain, you know? It's more like a disconnection from everything that used to matter.
So what is actually going on in the brain here? Well, this is where we get to the idea of emotional numbing. Imagine your brain is trying to protect you from being overwhelmed for too long, so it just starts turning down the volume on life. All the colors get a little less bright. It's a defense mechanism, not a failure to feel.
And this is so important to get. This state of being, it is not a sign of weakness. It is not laziness, and it is absolutely 100% not a choice. It's a psychological and even biological adaptation to circumstances that have become too much to bear.
You know, this whole process doesn't just happen overnight. It starts with some kind of prolonged emotional strain. Could be stress, disappointment, maybe some unresolved pain. So the brain kicks into protection mode, and that's when emotional sensitivity gets turned down. But that protection, well, it comes at a cost. And that cost is a numbness that slowly disconnects you from what gives life meaning.
Now, this whole adaptation doesn't just affect our feelings, it actually changes the way we think. And a lot of the time, it's not in the loud, screaming, self-critical way we might expect. No, it's in these really quiet, really subtle shifts in our own internal voice.
For example, a thought like this might pop up. Just a quiet little question, what's the point? But over time, that one little question can slowly eat away at your motivation for everything.
Or how about this one? I'll deal with it later. This isn't just regular procrastination. It's a sign that your mental and emotional battery is just totally drained. Even the simplest decisions can feel way too heavy to deal with right now. And then there's this one. It doesn't really matter. This thought just chips away at your sense of purpose. Things you used to love, things you valued, they start to feel flat. They lose their color, their importance.
So you see how these subtle thoughts can really add up. Psychologists have a term for this. They call it a narrowing of cognitive focus. And what's so interesting is your mind doesn't necessarily fill up with negative thoughts. It just sort of empties out the hopeful ones. The future starts to feel smaller, and your options just seem to shrink.
And of course, these internal shifts start to show up on the outside, in our behavior. You might start pulling away from friends, canceling plans, or just losing interest in hobbies you used to love. But it's so important to remember, these aren't acts of rejecting other people. They're acts of self-preservation. You're just trying to save energy.
And this is where a quiet, really sneaky internal cycle can start to take hold. A cycle that just reinforces the very state it's coming from. So it starts here. That need to save energy leads to pulling away from people. But that very act can make you feel incredibly isolated and lonely. And then, that loneliness, it just becomes fuel for that hopeless, flat kind of thinking we were just talking about. It reinforces the idea that you really are disconnected, that things aren't going to get better. And of course, that kind of thinking just makes you want to withdraw even more, to protect whatever little energy you have left. And so the cycle just keeps going, silently, where no one can see it. This is exactly why it can be so invisible, especially in people who are considered high-functioning. You know, they're the ones who are seen as responsible, reliable. They're often so emotionally aware that they know exactly how to perform normal for the outside world, even when their inner world is completely falling apart. So instead of using the massive amount of energy it would take to explain this really complex internal state, the language becomes a kind of code. I'm struggling turns into a much simpler, more socially acceptable, I'm tired. It's shorthand for a feeling that feels way too big to explain.
So let's just take a second to reflect here. Does any of this feel familiar? Do you ever feel just emotionally exhausted, even when, on paper, nothing is actually wrong?
Or what about this? Do you find yourself pulling away from people not because you don't like them, not at all, but because the simple act of just being present feels incredibly heavy?
And finally, do you ever tell yourself and everyone else that you're fine, mostly because the alternative, just trying to explain how you really feel, seems completely and totally overwhelming?
If any of that sounds familiar, the most important takeaway is this. It is not a flaw in your character. It's a psychological signal. It's your mind trying to tell you that something inside needs your attention.
And this is just such a powerful way to reframe it. Depression doesn't mean you're broken. It means some essential part of you, maybe your needs, your pain, your stress, has gone unheard for way too long.
So, the vital point we're left with is that healing doesn't start by trying to force yourself to be happy. It begins with the quiet and honestly courageous act of understanding yourself. And sometimes that simple act of listening is the most powerful step forward you can possibly take.